What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is December 18th, 2025, about 8 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 10 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by Thomas Hardy Leahey. Hopefully you're enjoying this reading as we go through Western civilization's winding history leading up to the invention of the field of psychology. In our previous episode, we finished all of chapter 4. Now we are going to take a stab at trying to finish all of chapter 5. I will read as much as I can before I have to leave for my next class. Without further ado, let's go here. Chapter 5, the Scientific Revolution. I'm going to zoom in a bit so people can see. Let's go. Foundations of Modernity. From 1600 to 1700. The 2 centuries after 1600 were literally revolutionary. The period began with the scientific revolution of the 17th century and closed with political revolutions in colonial America and monarchical France. The scientific revolution and the revolutions and conceptions of human nature and society that followed in its wake laid the basis for political revolutions that implemented their ideas. In the 17th century, there was a general crisis in which the old feudal order died away and began to be replaced by the modern secular capitalist nation-states that survive today. The transformation was completed during the 18th century, the Enlightenment, in which traditional ideas about human nature, society, and government were replaced by ideas that were scientific or scientifically inspired. To the medieval and Renaissance thinker, the cosmos was a somewhat mysterious place, organized in a grand hierarchy from God to angels to humans to the material world, where each event had a special meaning. This worldview was profoundly spiritual, as matter and soul were not sharply divided. In the 17th century, this view was replaced by one that was scientific, mathematical, and mechanical. Natural scientists demonstrated the mechanical nature of heavenly and earthly phenomena, and then of the bodies of animals. Eventually, the mechanical approach was extended to humanity itself, and the study of humankind, from politics to psychology, was subjected to the scientific method. By 1800, both the universe and humanity were believed to be machines subject to natural law. In the process, the ancient view of the world and its relation to humankind as a pattern of mystically meaningful symbols disappeared. The Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution outshines everything since the rise of Christianity and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes, mere internal displacements within the system of medieval Christendom, said somebody named Butterfield in 1965. All right, let's go here. The importance of science in the modern world cannot be doubted, and the scientific revolution cannot be passed over by any history of the West, especially a history of science, even if that science, psychology in this instance, was not part of the revolution. The outcome of the scientific revolution is unquestioned. It displaced the earth from the center of the universe and made of the universe a gigantic machine quite independent of human feelings and needs. It overthrew the Aristotelian natural philosophy of scholasticism, substituting a search for precise mathematical regularities confirmable by experiment. It substituted a new view of the universe as a machine for the older Greek and Roman views of the universe as divine being or readable book, which had mutated into a strange combination of magical and occult ideas. Early scientists had to free themselves from religious dogma. On the one hand, the old earth-centered system was, according to the Catholic Church, a teaching that we impose, and mysticism on the other. It was a three-sided game. Scientists and occultists opposed the church for being dogmatic. The church and scientists opposed the occultists for believing in alchemy and spirits. And the church and occultists opposed science for its implicit materialism and atheism. Scientists also proposed that people could improve their lot by the application of reason and experiment rather than by prayer and devotion, or the futile practice of magic. It also created modern consciousness and its science, psychology. Going up here to this part, The ornate clock at the Cathedral of Strasbourg in France. Key to the scientific revolution was replacing the Stoic idea of the universe as a living organism whose goals and workings are opaque to humans with the idea of the universe as a machine, which has no goals of its own and whose workings can be examined and known by human beings. Above all, it implied that instead of being subservient to nature, nature could be mastered and controlled by us. As one of the founders of modern science, Francis Bacon, said, "Knowledge is power, a concept foreign to the ancients." Continuing here. Continuity or revolution. One of the most disputed issues in the history of science concerns the degree of continuity between ancient and medieval science on the one hand and modern science on the other. Recent scholarship suggests that the answer to this question depends on whether we approach it from an internalist or externalist approach. The internalist history of science focuses on learning how scientists thought about the technical problems of their field, such as the dynamics of motion and how they formulated and tested theories. The externalist history of science looks at the broader social and institutional context in which scientific practice is embedded. Traditional internalist histories of the scientific revolution have concluded that there is a sharp break between medieval and modern science. Recent external histories stress continuity. As we shall learn, both views are right. Here's a portrait of Sir Isaac Newton right here, looking like a bad bitch. Why did the scientific revolution take place in Europe? The new external histories have approached the problem by asking a novel question. Why did the breakthrough to modern science occur in Europe rather than one of the other great world cultures such as Islam or China? If an alien anthropologist, knowing that a scientific revolution had occurred, had surveyed the world around 1000 CE, he or she would never have expected that the revolution would have occurred in Europe. Compared to Islam, which had preserved and translated the scientific works of ancient Greece, including Aristotle, Europe would have seemed mired in ignorance. Compared to China, with its vast riches and learned culture, unified under a single emperor, Europe would have seemed impoverished, illiterate, and nearly anarchic in its feudal political structure. And these judgments would have been correct. However, in just a few hundred years, European science had advanced far beyond Islamic science and was poised to unite the world by trade and imperial conquest. The secret to European success lay not in the scientific revolution itself, but in larger social institutions that provided a set of socialist structures that made free scientific inquiry possible. We have already seen the foundations for Europe's uniqueness in the early Middle Ages, in Anselm's faith-seeking reason, and in the rise of autonomous cities. The fact that Islam failed to develop modern science while Europe did is due to several interrelated factors. How religion spread. Christianity spread slowly through the Roman world as a persecuted religion that had to persuade pagans by arguments to become Christian. Islam, on the other hand, spread rapidly by military conquest across North Africa and the Middle East. I've already gone off multiple times about how Thomas Hardy Leahey is Islamophobic at worst or Islamo-ignorant at best. But I'm letting it slide. I'm not going to be ranting every time he does one of these ridiculous diatribes, but I'm going to continue. So Islam spread rapidly by military conquest across North Africa and the Middle East, holding Spain for centuries and nearly capturing Vienna. Thus, although Christians did not wholly accept pagan philosophy, and indeed lost touch with most of it, Christian philosophy and theology absorbed Hellenistic modes of thought, including respect for rational argument and the separation of speaker and idea characteristic of open systems of thought. As conquerors, Muslims could hold themselves aloof from pagans, Jews, and Christians, rejecting their ideas as contrary to the revelation of the Quran. Pagans faced the choice of conversion, death, or slavery. Jews and Christians were tolerated as Fellow monotheists, Muslims consider Islam to be the perfection of the monotheism of the Torah and the Bible, but were not politically equal to Muslims. They had to pay special taxes for their toleration and lacked some of the legal rights of Muslims. Nevertheless, Jews were better off in Islam than in Europe, where they faced constant persecution, occasional pogroms, and periodic expulsions from the countries in which they lived. Separation of church and state. In Matthew, chapter 22, verse 21, Jesus says, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." In this saying, Jesus acknowledges that secular non-religious authority is valid in its own sphere, in this case, taxation. The separation of church and state was reinforced by the European discovery and acceptance of the old Roman corpus of civil law, which became the basis of secular European law. Islam recognized no separation of religious and secular authority. Muhammad was both religious prophet and conquering political ruler, as were his immediate successors, the caliphs. Later, political disputes about who was the prophet's legitimate successor divided the Islamic world into competitive sects. Today's political boundaries in the Islamic world were imposed at the end of World War II by Britain and France, breaking up the older, united House of Islam. Creation of neutral spaces, the universities, for free inquiry. Just as religious and secular authority were separate, so European law recognized the existence of autonomous, self-governing corporations independent of both religious and royal or aristocratic secular power. We have met the first examples of these autonomous corporations, the free cities of Europe. More important for the history of science and philosophy were the European universities, which were also autonomous, self-governing corporations that could establish their own curricula relatively free from outside meddling. Thus, in Europe, neutral spaces were created within which to pursue natural philosophy for its own sake with little fear of repression. The law of Islam, the Sharia, did not recognize corporate bodies of any sort. Islamic colleges or madrasas were oriented to the teaching of Sharia and primarily involved rote memorization of the Quran and the Hadiths, the oral teachings of Muhammad. Thus, William of Ockham wrote, "In natural philosophy, everyone should be free to say freely whatever he pleases." While the Islamic thinker Al-Ghazali wrote, "No obligations flow from reason, but from the Sharia." Authority of the book. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all religions of a book, the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. And Muslims regard Islam as the final fruit of the first two. However, as the quote from Al-Ghazali indicates, in Islam, the Sharia, the Islamic law derived from the Quran and the Hadiths, became the final and exclusive authority on every aspect of life. In Europe, on the other hand, while the Bible was revered, it was also criticized and limited in authority. William of Conscience wrote, "To seek the reason of things and the laws of their origins is the great mission of the believer, which we must carry out by the fraternal association of our own inquiring minds. Thus, it is not the Bible's role to teach you the nature of things. That is the domain of natural philosophy." In the Muslim world, however, Al-Ghazali, in his The Incoherence of the Philosophers, took a torch to thinkers such as Ibn Sina, who had cast off the reins of religion, whose unbelief is their hearing high-sounding names like Socrates. Plato and Aristotle. Al-Ghazali condemned Ibn Sina and his like as apostates, a death sentence in Islam, putting an end to secular philosophy and science in Islam. Reception of Aristotelian natural philosophy. During the early Middle Ages, only the world of Islam retained and translated the works of Greek natural philosophy. In the early Middle Ages, there was a movement, Kalam, whose aim was to reconcile natural philosophy and Islamic revelation. But creative use of Greek natural philosophy essentially ended with Ibn Sina. Greek sciences were called foreign sciences, and Islamic scholars developed only those aspects of Greek mathematics and science that they found practically useful. Thus, geometry and trigonometry were studied and improved because they made it possible for believers to calculate the location of Mecca for their daily prayers. And algebra was developed because it aided in the fair apportionment of inheritances. Al-Ghazali feared that students of Greek sciences, mathematics, and logic would be infected with the evil and corruption of the natural philosophers. The Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun wrote, "The problems of physics are of no importance for us in our religious affairs and livelihoods. Therefore, we must leave them alone." In contrast, European philosophers warmly embraced Greek knowledge when they learned about it from contact with Islam after 1100, and Aristotelian natural philosophy quickly became the centerpiece of the university curriculum. In contrast to Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun, European philosophers and theologians regarded the ancients as moving toward God through reason, to which theologians could add Christian revelation. They strove to reconcile theology and natural philosophy into a harmonious view of the universe. Although conservative theologians made occasional attempts to ban aspects of Aristotelian science, they failed. Going on to public knowledge. As we have seen, certain traditions of learning in the Hellenistic world, especially Neoplatonism, encouraged the idea of double truth, the idea that there was one truth for the learned cognoscenti who gathered around teachers such as Hypatia of Alexandria, and another for the public at large. This notion prevailed in Islam, but not in Europe. For example, Islam banned printing until the 19th century, while books of all types, including the Bible, were in circulation in Europe from the time of Gutenberg, 1400 to 1468, onward. In the medieval universities, disputations on philosophical and theological topics were public, whereas in Islam, teaching of philosophy was typically a secret affair carried on between a master and a student. Making knowledge public was important in another respect, both for the scientific revolution and for the industrial revolution that followed. While secret learning died with its possessor, public recording of achieved knowledge made breakthroughs cumulative. Isaac Newton once said, if he had seen farther than others, it was because he stood on the shoulders of giants. Hidden learning provides no shoulders. We can find scattered around the Islamic world little beginnings of science and technology, from the copper mines of the Near East to Islamic astronomy, but in every case, these breakthroughs petered out. A key reason these stirrings toward modernity died was institutional. They often depended on the whims and interests of powerful rulers who could support research and industry, but support typically dried up when a new, differently minded king or emperor came to power. More importantly, there were no institutions that preserved and transmitted innovative ideas and practices. Without preservation and transmission, even the greatest of ideas can have little or no impact on the world. The developments of literacy and printing aided the transmission of ideas, but so did the concept that ideas ought to be shared rather than hidden as dangerous or kept as proprietary secrets. It was only in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries that ideas were openly spread, openly debated, and openly employed, making possible the accumulation of effective knowledge and the continuous building of science and technology. Secondary causation. Aristotle ascribed all change in the universe to an unmoved mover, and naturally enough, Christian and Islamic thinkers identified the unmoved mover with their creator, God. However, a question arose that was of great importance for the development of modern scientific thinking. As the creator of the world, God was responsible for its existence, but was he responsible for every event every day? Some of Aristotle's followers developed the idea of secondary causation. God created the world, but endowed objects with the power to affect other objects. Thus, a bowling ball was the power to knock down pins. This concept was accepted by Christian natural philosophers in the Middle Ages. As a medieval natural philosopher, Jean Buridan, born 1300 and died in 1358, Jean Buridan wrote, "In natural philosophy, we ought to accept actions and dependencies as if they always proceed in a natural way." Hugh of St. Victor, who was born in 1096 and died in 1141, depicted the world as a self-operating machine. The visible world is this machine, this universe that we see with our bodily eyes. These sayings reflect the acceptance of Greek naturalism by European philosophers. Naturalism and secondary causation were, however, rejected in Islam in favor of a doctrine called occasionalism, which also made a brief appearance in 17th century Europe. The theological problem with secondary causation was that it took some causal power away from God and gave it to physical objects, thus subtracting from God's omnipotence and implying perhaps that God is no longer present in his world. Occasionalism held that in every instant of time, God annihilates and recreates the entire universe. Thus we see the bowling ball touch the pins, and then we see the pins fall down. But the ball did not cause the pins to fall down, God did. Plainly, developing a modern scientific view of the universe in which objects act upon each other in lawful causal ways would be difficult within the worldview of occasionalism. In summary, natural philosophy in Europe took off around 1200 CE. At the same time, scientific inquiry froze in Islam. Christian philosophers and theologians welcomed the task of reconciling faith and reason, while Muslim thinkers came to reject it. The situation in China was similar to that of Islam, although the Chinese were further hobbled in developing science by not knowing Greek natural philosophy. Oh, the chauvinism. Oh my God, the Western chauvinism. Oh my God. That was just egregious. I said I wasn't going to rant, but that sentence was just so egregious. The situation in China was similar to that of Islam, although the Chinese were further hobbled in developing science by not knowing Greek natural philosophy. I want to throw up. Oh my God. Yeah, the Chinese were struggling because they didn't have us. The white man wasn't there to give them natural philosophy. Horrendous. As in Islam, religion and state were not separated. The emperor ruled by possession of a mandate from heaven, and his rule was absolute and all-pervading. Like Islam, but unlike Europe, autonomous corporations such as cities and universities did not develop. The concept of the mandate of heaven inhibited the development of astronomy, the field whence the scientific revolution sprang. Emperors maintained an imperial observatory whose job was to scan the heavens for signs of the gods' pleasure or displeasure with the emperor's actions. But this made the observatory's findings state secrets rather than public scientific data. The unique feature of Chinese intellectual life that inhibited the development of natural philosophy and science was the mandarinate. Although the emperor reigned, the reins of government lay in the hands of the elite government bureaucrats, the mandarins. Entry into and advancement within the Mandarin bureaucracy depended on taking a series of civil service examinations that assessed the candidate's mastery of classical Chinese literature. Philosophy and science formed no part of the examination system, and so there was no motive to study or develop them. Within the medieval university, European natural philosophers and theologians began to revive the Greek miracle. They embraced Greek naturalism as embodied in Aristotle's scientific approach to the universe. Sigurd of Brabant, born 1240 and died in 1282, Sigurd said, "We natural philosophers are not discussing God's miracles. What we have to do is to discuss what is natural in a natural way." Nicholas Oresme, born 1320 and died in 1382, said, "The philosopher's work is to make marvels cease." They embraced the Greek attitude of separating the character of a thinker from his ideas, making natural philosophy into an open system of thought. When theologians such as Aquinas found Aristotle in disagreement with Christian faith, they did not reject him as a heretic, but sought to reconcile his reasoning with Christian faith. They embraced the Greek idea of theoretical explanation, and natural philosophers such as Oresme and Jean Buridan produced innovative ideas in physics. Medieval artisans made important technical innovations, such as lenses, leading to the invention of the telescope and clocks. Watches were a stunning novelty in Islam as late as 1800. Continuing on here to war. All right. Although an old song says that war is good for absolutely nothing, it in fact played an important role in the rise of human civilization by creating central governments able to suppress banditry and feuding between extended families, creating peace and stability within national borders. In the present context, however, what is important is that how war developed in Europe was different from how it developed elsewhere, in ways that promoted the scientific revolution. In the great civilizations outside Europe, geographically large states obtained monopolies on violence within their borders and went to war only against technologically inferior nomads on their borders. Therefore, they had little incentive to innovate on weaponry, including the crucial technology of gunpowder, rifles, and artillery. Europe, on the other hand, was divided for reasons of geography and legacies of Roman and medieval history into small states which competed in a sort of tournament among equals for glory and power. Because they were roughly equal in resources, any edge in weaponry that one state might obtain was important. So European sovereigns encouraged technical and scientific work that advanced gunpowder technology. A good example is the work of Benjamin Robbins in the 1740s. Robbins used Newtonian physics to calculate the movement of projectiles in the presence of air resistance, as had not been done before. He proposed that instead of being round and fired from smooth-barreled guns, projectiles should be elongated and fired from rifle barrels in order to minimize air resistance and maximize accuracy. He concluded that whatever state shall adopt rifle barrel pieces will acquire military superiority. As each country mastered the latest technology and innovated past it, scientific and engineering progress was encouraged in Europe as nowhere else. Moving forward, revolution, the mechanization of the world picture. Nevertheless, the conclusion of the old internalist histories of science stands. Modern science did not grow out of medieval science. Medieval philosophers and theologians were hobbled by their reverence for authoritative texts, whether the Bible or Aristotle's. They defined their jobs as the reconciliation of conflicting authorities, and they became excellent at reading texts closely and producing subtle, sometimes over subtle, readings of discrepant texts. Their subtlety earned the ire of the scientific revolutionaries who regarded their scholastic predecessors as worthless logic choppers and mental gymnasts. Because of their reverence for authorities, medieval natural philosophers were trapped within Aristotle's system of thought, which, although admirably naturalistic, had the defect of being wrong. They tried to show how the everyday world of experience could be explained by Aristotle's science. But although they suggested many thought experiments to support their arguments, they did not actually perform any experiments. Thinking Aristotle essentially correct, they formed no notion of science as a progressive enterprise that constantly discards old, incorrect theories for newer and better ones. The upshot was that although the European universities made natural philosophy possible and taught most of the makers of the scientific revolution, the makers' work took place outside the universities, where it remained until the 19th century. The scientific revolution took a long time and drew from many sources, but it was a revolution, for it profoundly and permanently altered human life and human self-understanding. The revolution may be said to have begun in 1543 with the publication of Nicholas Copernicus's Revolution of the Heavenly Orbs, which proposed that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the solar system. Sigmund Freud would later call Copernicus's hypothesis the first great blow to the human ego. No longer could humans pride themselves on living at the center of the universe and being those around whom everything else revolved. An alternative date is offered by Wooten, who claims the beginning of the revolution coincides with the observation of a new unknown star, actually a supernova, by the astronomer Tycho Brahe in 1572. Brahe's observation was important because, following Plato, pre-modern thinkers believed that the heavens beyond the earth were perfect and changeless, as opposed to the mundane world inhabited by people. But Brahe's discovery suggested otherwise, that the heavens were no more perfect and eternal than life on earth. However, Copernicus's physics was Aristotelian, and his system was no better supported by the data than the old Ptolemaic one, although some found its simplicity attractive. Galileo Galilei, born 1564 and died in 1642, was the most effective spokesman for the new system, supporting it with his new physics, which helped make sense of the sun-centered proposal, and produced telescopic evidence that the moon and other celestial bodies were no more heavenly than the earth. However, Galileo, like Copernicus, could not shake the old Greek assumption that the motion of the planets had to be circular, even though his friend Johann Kepler, born 1571 and died 1630, showed planetary orbits to be elliptical. The final unity of celestial and earthly physics and the ultimate victory of the new worldview of science came from Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687. Newton's laws of motion put the capstone on the idea that the universe was a machine, a celestial clockwork. The machine analogy was proposed by Kepler, Galileo, and René Descartes, and quickly became a popular view of the universe. Originally, it was put forward as a support for religion against magic and alchemy. God, the master engineer, constructed a perfect machine and left it running. The only operative principles are, therefore, mechanical, not occult. Magical machinations cannot affect machines. Kepler stated the new viewpoint quite forcefully. I am much occupied with the investigation of physical causes. My aim in this is to show that the machine of the universe is not similar to a divine animated being, but similar to a clock. The clockwork conception of the universe had important implications for psychology. In the Stoic or Aristotelian theories of the universe, everything and every event in the universe had a purpose, a final cause. Thinking of the universe as a living thing like ourselves Thinking of the universe as a living thing like ourselves naturally led people to give teleological explanations of physical events, the way we give teleological explanations of human and animal behavior. Just as a warrior strives for victory in battle, fire strives to join its fellow starfires in the heavens, and a rock drops from our hands, striving to return to the earth. The scientific view of the universe, however, radically separated God, a living being, from the universe, a physical machine made by him. A clockmaker makes a clock, and the purpose behind the clock rests in the maker. The clock itself has no purpose, moving, as Kepler said, only by physical causes. Nevertheless, the motions of the clockwork universe, like the motions of a clock, appear to have purpose behind them. As the physicist Robert Boyle, born 1627 and died in 1691, wrote about both clocks and the clockwork universe, each part performs its part in order to the various ends for which it was contrived by its designer, and regularly and uniformly as if it knew and were concerned to its duty. Machines, scientists discovered, behaved as if they were moved by inner purposes, though having none. Soon scientists, led by Descartes, proposed that animals are clockwork mechanisms, beast machines, and that human beings are beast machines with souls inside. Thus, just as God gives purpose to his universe, the human soul gives purpose to its body. However, animals behave in purposive ways, but have no souls. Like the mechanical universe, they act as if they have motives, but are, in fact, moved only by physical causes. Such a line of thinking led inevitably to the idea that we, human beings too, are machines that act as if we have purposes when we are in fact simply complex machines moved only by physical causes. As belief in a soul became less tenable and as machines became more sophisticated, culminating in computers capable of beating the reigning human chess champion, the idea that human beings are machines possessing only as if teleology gained momentum. This idea is a major theme in the story of scientific psychology from the 17th to the 20th century. What was revolutionized? Mathematical versus experimental sciences. Kuhn proposed that at the time of the scientific revolution, two distinct scientific traditions at different states of maturity could be identified. The first, more mature tradition consisted of what Kuhn called the mathematical or classical sciences. Kuhn called the second, less developed tradition the experimental or Baconian sciences. The classical sciences were sciences such as astronomy and optics that had been treated mathematically from the times of Greek and Roman antiquity. The classical sciences were not experimental in the sense we understand experimentation today. As we've seen, experiments in ancient and medieval physics were often thought experiments, not actually carried out. And in astronomy, which provided the empirical data for Newton's Principia, experimentation was obviously impossible. When experiments were carried out in these sciences, they were like classroom experiments in a modern science class, demonstrations of what is already known to be true, rather than investigations meant to reveal new truths about nature. The key feature of the classical sciences, then, was that theory preceded experimentation. A mathematical theory about the movements of the planets or the behavior of light was proposed, and then a few demonstrations were offered to support the theory. Nature was not interfered with or interrogated, it was simply observed. The experimental sciences lacked sophisticated mathematical theories, but were instead based on experimental studies of nature with little or no theoretical expectations. Kuhn called them the Baconian sciences because Sir Francis Bacon, born 1561 and died in 1626, developed the idea of experimentation in the modern sense as a controlled interrogation of nature. He called such inquiries twisting the lion's tail. Classical scientists looked at nature as it was an ordinary experience. Baconian experiments created conditions that would never exist without the interference of a scientist. Bacon himself died from such an experiment. Wanting to know the effects of refrigeration on meat, he stuffed a dead chicken with snow, but caught pneumonia as a result. For Bacon, science was a hunt for new facts about nature rather than a demonstration of what was known. Although Bacon presented his approach to science as novel, in fact, it had a history as ancient as the classical sciences, except that its history was somewhat disreputable. In Chapter 2, we learned that the ancient Greeks valued theoria, abstract mathematical contemplation of eternal truth, over metis. Metis being the practical knowledge of artisans and merchants. The classical sciences carried all the prestige of theoria, mathematical theories about nature that could be mastered only by an elite educated few. Although disdained by the elite, metis had its own ancient tradition outside elite science and books of secrets and their authors, professors of secrets. These books of secrets contained a mishmash of recipes for two ancient secret traditions. The first tradition was the Neoplatonic Hermetic tradition that arose in the Hellenistic period, which gave rise to the idea of supernatural magic based on spells and the invocation of supernatural beings. The second tradition was the Metis tradition of practical know-how. Guilds of artisans kept secret their practical recipes for things such as dyeing cloth in order to maintain their lucrative monopolies. Their recipes were, of course, the fruit of centuries of practical experimentation, but no theories had been developed to explain why the recipes worked. Once printing was invented, however, guild secrets soon became public knowledge in so-called books of secrets. But these books remained outside the boundaries of reputable science because of their inclusion of the Hermetic tradition of supernatural magic. The figure of the Professor of Secrets and the Hermetic Magus was memorably captured by the German author Goethe, who lived from 1749 and died in 1832. Goethe published Faust, which is his famous book, where the Hermetic Magus was captured. After a prologue that takes place in heaven, Faust opens the play with a summary of a medieval academic career and laments its shortcomings. I have, alas, studied philosophy, jurisprudence, and medicine too, and worst of all, theology, with keen endeavor through and through. And here I am, for all my lore, the wretched fool I was before, called Master of Arts and Doctor to boot. For 10 years almost I confute, and up and down wherever it goes, I drag my students by the nose, and see that for all our science and art, we can know nothing, it burns my heart. Hence I have yielded to magic to see what secret force hides in the world and rules its course. Envisage the creative blazes instead of rummaging in phases. I like that. 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 Faust, master and even doctor, is at the seeming pinnacle of medieval learning. The opening lines list the available fields of study in the medieval university, all of which he has mastered, but the last line decries the useless text-oriented basis of medieval education. Faust wants more, to know the secrets of nature and to hold power over nature. So he turns from text to practical magic and ultimately sells his soul to the devil to know what secret force hides in the world and rules its course. Faust symbolizes the desire for practical, usable knowledge that motivated the disreputable professors of secrets. He intends to experiment on nature to learn its secrets and to twist the lion's tail to useful ends. Science and occultism were linked until the scientific revolution was completed in the 18th century. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, born 1883 and died in 1946, bought some obscure manuscripts of Newton and discovered them to be about his experiments in alchemy, and he described Newton as not altogether a scientist but the last of the magicians. The experimental tradition in science would not come into its own until the 19th century. Science, as we know it today, merges Kuhn's two forms of science. From the classical sciences comes the idea that science must develop precise, ideally mathematical theories that explain how nature works. From the experimental sciences comes the idea that science depends on the active interrogation of nature, a hunt for its secrets. From the experimental tradition bolstered by Protestant Christianity also comes the idea that science should be useful. Bacon wrote, "The rule in religion that a man should demonstrate his faith in works applies in natural philosophy as well. Knowledge should be proved by its works." The authority and prestige of psychology today rests largely on its claims to improve society and individual lives. We're going to go back up here and read this box on Sir Francis Bacon. Planning for Modernity, the first modernist. Although born of a noble family, Francis Bacon, born 1561 and died in 1626, was its youngest son, inheriting nothing and so had to live by his wits, starting out as a law student but ultimately rising to become Lord Chancellor of England under King James I. He was caught in a bribery scandal typical of his age and was banned from public life. Free to pursue his real passion, the reformation of learning, Bacon turned out a number of works foundational to the Enlightenment and modernism. In the sense I've defined modernism, reflecting on the conditions of living a modern life, Bacon cannot, of course, have been a modernist. What marks him as a modernist? Bacon cannot, of course, have been a modernist. What marks him as modernist is that, unlike Machiavelli, he wanted to live a modern life and was the first person to sketch what that life was like. Okay. All right, so yeah, he started out as he came from a noble family. He was very smart, studied at school. He became Lord Chancellor of England. Okay. All right, interesting. So he lived a noble's life. Anyway, I'm going to continue here. Not only did Bacon set knowledge at the heart of modern life, but he also defined knowledge in a way that we take for granted, but was radically innovative in his time. First, Bacon elevated scientific knowledge over other forms of knowledge. Bacon shared this ambition with early modern thinkers such as Descartes, who wanted to make natural philosophy, as science was then called, first among its equals, at least in the intellectual world, more important than theology, then the queen of the sciences, or humanistic practices such as poetry. More peculiar to Bacon were his emphases on practical, useful knowledge and on the pursuit of knowledge as a collective, organized, systematic, cumulative enterprise. For the Greeks, as you've learned, knowledge was contemplation, theoria. The great goal of the philosopher was truth. For there, among the forms, as Plato put it, was the right and the best way of life. For Bacon, truth was not enough. Indeed, it could be beside the point. The real test of knowledge lay in control, being able to do something with one's ideas. This, for Bacon, did not mean only application to everyday life, though he did include that. It meant being able to accomplish something experimentally. Part of the idea of contemplative knowledge was its passivity. One watched nature to try to figure out how it worked. Bacon insisted on interrogating nature by experiment, by proving one's ideas by active engagement with nature. Bacon also pointed forward to the modern idea of knowledge-seeking as an organized collective activity. The thinkers you've met so far were mostly solitary, being in a sense more like artists than scientists. Although they sought audiences and followers, they did not think of philosophy or technology as team efforts. Philosophers tended to form schools arrayed against one another. Practical thinkers, medics in Greek terms, sought useful knowledge from which they could make a living, and naturally tended to keep their ideas secret. Bacon's modernizing conception of research is seen most clearly in his short utopian work, The New Atlantis, which describes how shipwrecked sailors wash up on the shores of a previously unknown island, New Atlantis, and are given a rather didactic tour by its inhabitants. The most important institution of New Atlantis is Solomon's House, which is in effect a modern research university, though run on more hierarchical lines than contemporary universities. There are teams of specialized researchers, those who cull learning from books, those who try experiments on nature, and so on. The findings of these teams are then compiled and combined by other teams who seek to discover more general scientific principles and direct the making of new experiments. All the resulting knowledge is shared, and the aim is finding the usable truth, not creating schools of thought or penetrating metaphysical insights into Platonic truth, the nature of being. The organization of New Atlantis reflects a final aspect of Bacon's thought, the idea that knowledge is best found by working upward from facts to the forming of generalizations. From Plato onward, the ancients had stressed the certainty of deductive reasoning from axioms to the formation of proofs, as in Pythagorean geometry. You will meet this ideal of reasoning even in one of the first modern philosophers, Descartes. He searched first for a single truth, cogito ergo sum, from which he then proceeded to deduce the rest of his system of thought. Bacon said we should work the other way, beginning with careful observation of facts and experiments on nature, and forming general conclusions only when they are fully justified. Bacon's attitude was the foundation of positivism. Bacon was modernist above all in his quip that knowledge is power, the motto of your author's junior high school. Bacon's ideas will come to fruition in the Industrial Enlightenment. Bacon died in service of his ideals, catching fatal pneumonia from stuffing a chicken with snow in order to understand the preservative power of freezing. When you thaw a pizza, think of bacon. Okay, let's jump here to our next part. Psychology invented the way of ideas, the transformation of experience, and the disenchantment of the world. The makers of the scientific revolution created the concept of consciousness as they created a radically new theory of perception that went with their new scientific epistemology. Descartes was the most important artisan of this project, creating a definition of consciousness that ruled philosophical and scientific thought for centuries. The Cartesian idea of consciousness as an inner mental space would have puzzled Greek or medieval philosophers. Aristotle's realist theory of perception had been preserved and developed by the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages. In an act of perception, the sense organ received the form but not the matter of the object perceived. For example, if I look at the Venus del Milo, my eye receives the statue's form but does not receive the marble of which it is made. Thus, I am directly acquainted with all the features that define the Venus statue, not only its size and shape, but also its color and even its beauty. According to this account, there is therefore a direct objective correlation between the formal order of the universe and my experience of it. The assertion that beauty is part of the statue's form to be simply picked up by the mind strongly underscores how different our post-Cartesian understanding of perception is from Aristotle's. The Venus del Milo, on his account, is objectively beautiful, but while we regard beauty as a culturally informed, private judgment of the mind. Similarly, whether or not an action was moral or immoral was held to be an objective fact, not a subjective judgment. Let's read that sentence again. The Venus del Milo, on his account, is objectively beautiful. Who is his? The assertion that beauty is part of the statue's form is to be simply picked up by the mind strongly underscores how different our post-Cartesian understanding of perception is from Aristotle's. Okay, so according to Aristotle, there is a thing as objective beauty, a true beauty. The Venus del Milo, on his account, is objectively beautiful, while we regard beauty as a culturally informed private judgment of the mind. Similarly, whether or not an action was moral or immoral was held to be an objective fact, not a subjective judgment. The undoing of Aristotelian perceptual theory began with the development of rigorous logic and mathematics in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. A conflict arose between elegant mathematical calculations applied to the universe and the messy appearances of our experiences of the universe. In many respects, the essence of the scientific revolution was the complete subordination of the world as we experience it to the way mathematical reason conceives it. Truth came to lie in calculation rather than perception. As Galileo Galilei wrote in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, there is no limit to my astonishment when I reflect that Aristarchus and Copernicus were able to make reason so conquer sense that in defiance of the latter, the former became mistress of their belief. Let's read that again. Galileo wrote in the dialogue, there is no limit to my astonishment when I reflect that Aristarchus and Copernicus were able to make reason so conquer sense that in defiance of the latter, the former became mistress of their belief. The conquest of sense by reason created consciousness as an object of scientific concern, although not yet an object of scientific study. In the Assayer, Galileo expresses the new scientific attitude to experience that regarded the senses as deceptive and mathematics as the best guide to understanding the world. Here, he distinguished the primary physically objective and secondary subjective sense properties, and thus began to create the modern ideas of consciousness completed by Descartes. Whenever I conceive any material or corporeal substance, I immediately think of it as bounded, and as having this or that shape, as being large or small, and as being in motion or at rest. From these conditions, I cannot separate such a substance by any stretch of my imagination, but that it must be white or red, bitter or sweet, noisy or silent, and of sweet, of foul odor, my mind does not feel compelled to bring in as necessary accompaniments. Without the senses as our guides, reason or imagination unaided would probably never arrive at qualities like these. Hence, I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so on reside only in the consciousness, so that if the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated. The key word in this passage is consciousness. For ancient philosophers, there was only one world, the real physical world of which we are a part and with which we are in direct touch. But the concept of secondary sense properties created a new world, the inner world of consciousness, populated by mental objects or ideas, possessing sensory properties not found in objects themselves. Some of these secondary properties correspond to physical aspects of objects. For example, color corresponds to different wavelengths of light to which the cones in our retinas differentially respond. That color is not a primary property, however, is demonstrated by the existence of colorblind individuals, whose color perception is limited or absent. Objects are not colored. Only ideas are colored. Other secondary properties, such as being beautiful or good, are more troublesome because they seem to correspond to no physical facts, but reside only in consciousness. Our modern belief that beauty and goodness are subjective judgments informed by cultural norms is one consequence of the transformation of experience wrought by the scientific revolution. We also find in this passage the beginning of the scientific view from nowhere, described in chapter 1. Science aims to describe the world as it objectively is, as if no living creature dwelled upon it. In an important sense, the distinction of primary and secondary properties created psychology, or at least the psychology of consciousness. People were now compelled to ask how and why the secondary properties originate. If experience simply reflects the world as it is, then the problem of how it does so is a legitimate but not very profound question. If, however, the world of experience is radically different from the world as it is, then the creation of that subjective world, the world we live in as human beings, becomes a more interesting and important matter. Henceforth, until the behavioral redefinition of the field around 1900, psychology was the study of the relationship between the subjective world of consciousness and the physical world of matter. Understood this way, psychology was philosophically important because its study could shed light on the scope and limits of human knowledge. The order of human experience no longer had any reliable connection to the order of the world. Instead, experience, consciousness, needed to be corrected by mathematics, which depicts in imagination the world as it really is, a perfect machine without color, taste, aesthetic value, or moral import. The new scientific views of the mind and the world began to alienate human beings from the universe. Humans discovered that the world that they experienced was not the real world after all, but something created by their minds. Bluebirds are not really blue, and beautiful things are not really beautiful, and just acts are not really just. All are subjective judgments of private human minds. E.A. Burt contrasted the old worldview when experience and reality were harmonious with the new scientific one. The scholastic scientist looked out upon the world of nature, and it appeared to him a quite sociable and human world. It was finite in extent. It was made to serve his needs. It was clearly and fully intelligible, being immediately present to the rational powers of his mind. It was composed fundamentally of, and was intelligible through, those qualities which were most vivid and intense in his own immediate experience: color, sound, beauty, joy, heat, cold, fragrance, and its plasticity into purpose and ideal. Now the world is an infinite and monotonous mathematical machine. Not only is his high place in a cosmic teleology lost, but all these things which were the very substance of the physical world to the scholastic, the thing that made it alive and lovely and spiritual, are lumped together and crowded into the small, fluctuating, and temporary positions of extension, which we call human nervous systems. It was simply an incalculable change in the viewpoint of the world held by intelligent opinion in Europe. The mechanical philosophy offered a new proof of the existence of God, the argument from design. Just as the existence of a watch implies a watchmaker, the existence of the clockwork universe implies the existence of a divine watchmaker God. However, the radical separation of God from the clockwork universe he fashioned made God more distant from human life. Having created the perfect mechanical universe, it had no further need of his intervention. Indeed, as Nietzsche proclaimed centuries later, he may be dead, leaving us alone in a cold, impersonal universe. Science was deadly to the old medieval conception of God as an ever-present being manifested in signs and portents, and to the lingering Stoic idea, alluded to by Kepler, that the universe is a living, rational, developing being. Shortly after Europe was shattered by World War I, the German sociologist Max Weber, born 1864 and died in 1920, addressed deeply dispirited German students and linked the scientific revolution to their feelings of despair. He said the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. Nevertheless, although Weber knew his audience yearned to re-enchant the world, he said that science was the only path open to modern men and women, and he urged his listeners to stay on it with him. Because it was the science of the mind, German psychology was inevitably linked to the crisis Weber described. Gestalt psychology, as we will see, tried to re-enchant the world with science. Ancient science was now discredited, and so therefore was ancient philosophy. Sir Francis Bacon said, "There is but one course left, to try the whole thing anew upon a better plan, and to commence a total reconstruction of sciences, arts, and all human knowledge, raised upon the proper foundations." The two most important modern foundation layers were the Frenchman, René Descartes, and the Englishman, John Locke. Together, they created the basis for the first scientific psychology, the way of ideas. They identified a realm of consciousness detached from the realm of the physical world, thereby creating the possibility that there should be a science, psychology, to study the new world of the mind. All right, we're going to be continuing here. Let's see. All right. We're going to read one more section and then call it a day. Consciousness created. René Descartes, born 1596 and died in 1650. Psychology as we know it began with Descartes. For good or ill, Descartes created a framework for thinking about mind and body within which virtually all they were busy attacking Descartes' ideas. Descartes developed his radical new approach to psychology within a Christian worldview that had been profoundly altered by the Reformation and was being further reshaped by the scientific revolution. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had permitted the persistence of a wide range of pagan beliefs and practices that it either tolerated or exploited. Although condemned, but meeting little practical interference, witches and cunning men, even werewolves and vampires, continued to ply their trades, and people danced around maypoles. Saints were often identified with old pagan gods, and churches were built on sites sacred to them. As the pagan churches had, the medieval Catholic Church stressed orthopraxy, correct religious practice, over orthodoxy, correct religious belief. However, the new Protestant churches of the Reformation played down ritual and began to demand that their followers sincerely hold the right Christian beliefs. When the Catholic Church reformed itself during the Counter-Revolution, it too compelled not just external behavior submission to Christianity, but internal personal submission. Magical practices such as the wearing of amulets to cure headaches were denounced, witches, Jews, and heretics were persecuted, and priests were forbidden to run taverns on the side. Despite official doctrinal differences among the sects, a single, rather austere and puritanical religious sensibility appeared in 17th century Europe. The Christian God became a forbidding and remote figure whose power could not be commanded by magic. Into the vacuum stepped science, a secular, material, and effective way of gaining power over nature. Psychologically, the situation resembled the Hellenistic period, when traditional religions that demanded only that their followers practice cult rites were challenged by philosophers and new religions that drew people into themselves, demanding faith. Descartes' philosophy, as we shall see, was based on a radical version of such withdrawal. Descartes was closely connected with the circle of reforming Catholics led by the scientist and theologian Martin Mersenne, born 1588, died 1648. He has also been described as the Internet of the 17th century because he acted as a hub by which early scientists communicated with each other, forming the first scientific community. This group was particularly worried about the scientifically appealing but religiously dangerous ideas of Renaissance naturalism and occultism. Renaissance naturalism was scientific in that it explained the world without reference to supernatural powers, but it was suspect religiously because it seemed to grant supernatural powers to matter itself. Occultism invoked spiritual powers that could be manipulated by magic. There was, in fact, a shadowy organization, the Rosicrucians, that seemed to mix religion and a bit of science into an appealing but empty potpourri. Descartes spent many of his early years traveling Europe as a spy for the Jesuits on alleged Rosicrucians. Naturalism was especially dangerous to religious orthodoxy when applied to living things, particularly people. If a magnet had the natural power to attract metals, it seemed only a short step, taken in the 18th century, to saying that the brain has the power to think. Medieval and Renaissance physicians already attributed sensation, perception, common sense, imagination, memory, and other powers to the brain, so why not thought and knowledge too? However, if all mental functions are function of the body, as Aristotle had thought, then the existence of the Christian soul was placed in doubt. To counter Renaissance nature philosophy, Mersenne and his followers, including Descartes, believed and taught a clockwork view of the universe. Matter was completely inert, possessing no magnetism, gravity, or any other active power of any kind. Active power was reserved to God alone. Matter moved or changed only when physically pushed by another piece of matter. Newton's tolerance for unexplained forces, he proposed no hypothesis about how gravity worked, ultimately triumphed, but not without a struggle and with Descartes' followers on the other side. Descartes' conception of mind and body was very carefully worked out within this religious scientific framework, and it decisively shaped the scientific psychology that was yet to come. Descartes was committed to viewing animals as complex automata, machines whose operations could be fully explained as physical processes and without resort to vital forces of any kind. Thus, Descartes had to reject the idea that the heart was a spontaneously working pump circulating blood through the body, because its action seemed self-caused by an internal power, little different from attributing attractive power to magnets. However, the mental prowess of the beast machine were considerable. Everything Aristotle had attributed to the sensitive soul was included, and to the extent people were animals, human mental powers had to have a purely mechanical explanation. The place of the immortal human soul in a mechanical world and a mechanical body had become a serious problem. For our purposes, Descartes' life work can be divided into two phases. In the first phase, he focused on scientific and mathematical projects, including physics, but with a growing interest in physiology. His main philosophical project during this period was working out methodological rules by which the mind ought to be governed in its search for truth. Descartes' scientific work culminated in the writing of two large books, Le Monde, or The World, on physics, and the unfinished L'Homme, the Human, on physiology. Then, in November 1633, on the eve of the publication of Le Monde, Descartes learned of the condemnation of the Copernican hypothesis by the Roman Inquisition of Galileo's advocacy. To Mersenne, Descartes wrote that he was so surprised by Galileo's fate of house arrest for life that he almost burned all his private papers because his own system of the world depended so much on Galileo's. Nevertheless, I wouldn't want to publish a discourse which had a single word that the church disapproved of, so I prefer to suppress it rather than publish it in mutilated form. Thus began the second, primarily philosophical phase in Descartes' career. He decided that in order for his scientific views to win the acceptance that Galileo's had not, they needed careful and convincing philosophical justifications, and he proceeded to develop the philosophy that made him famous and influential. Very interesting. I didn't know that Descartes was a crazy Christian guy who, wanted to, preserve his perception as a faithful follower of the church. Very interesting. I didn't know that about Descartes. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up here. Hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. We'll start on this section the next time we meet. We'll finish up reading about Descartes. And hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you found it enlightening, creative, fun, engaging, all that good stuff. Maybe it helped you go to sleep as well. Who knows? But we're going to come back to this next time. Catch you tomorrow, and peace.